Well, it's 6:30, so even though people are still coming in, I think I'm going to start with a little bit of introduction about the Spirit Council. Welcome, everyone, and thank you. Thank you for joining us. I'm Nicole Kodak, one of the co-chairs of the Simsbury Spirit Council. We were launched in 2019 by the Department of Justice, and Spirit is a DOJ term that stands for Site Problem Identification and Resolution of Issues Together. We represent the community at large, and we serve as diversity champions to help Simsbury become more inclusive, fostering awareness, action, and a community where all voices are welcome and each and every individual can live, work, learn, and play in a safe environment with meaningful, healthy relationships. We would like to thank Simsbury Public Library for hosting this event, which is our 8th in a series of Let's Talk community conversations. And we would like to thank Kristen Formanek, the Director of Simsbury Community and Social Services, who is our town staff liaison. We offer a big thank you to our experts, Dr. Susan Eaton and Professor Anika Singh-Lamar. We are also grateful to our elected town officials, Bill Rice, Eric Wellman, and Sean Askham, for joining us this evening. And most importantly, we want to thank you, our community members, for coming tonight. As you know, the Simsbury Planning Commission has put forth a 5-year affordable housing plan as required by state law and has forwarded that to the Board of Selectmen for review. Tonight, we're hosting a community conversation with elected town officials on this topic. So this is a forum for all viewpoints, and we are encouraging your questions. We are glad so many of you have shown up, and it's exactly what we're aiming for: engagement with as many community members as possible to have a productive dialogue across differing viewpoints. So with that, I'm going to turn this event over to Nkosi Lee, who is the chair of the Simsbury Events Subcommittee and tonight's moderator. Nkosi.
All right. Good evening, everyone. We thank you all again for joining us. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedules to be a part of our audience, and we hope to participate in our discussion as well. Tonight, the focus of tonight's event is affordable housing. And so while we know there are many other issues and topics that are connected to affordable housing, our desire for tonight is to stay focused on that topic. And so we're not trying to go into any other areas, as though there are many that are connected to it, but let's try to stay focused so we can utilize our time accordingly. We know that the Affordable Housing Appeals Act, or Connecticut General Statutes 8-30G, has provided an avenue for additional affordable housing in Connecticut. And so the intent of the law was that every community in Connecticut will provide no less than 10% of total housing stock as affordable housing. And so again, that is our focus for this evening. And so currently Simsbury has 4.74% of the total housing stock considered to be affordable to those individuals that make less than the area median income. And so we have the privilege of welcoming 2 experts to open our event this evening, and 3 of Simsbury elected officials to present where we are and where we're going on the topic of affordable housing. We do have a few guidelines that we'd like to go over with all of you so we could try to make this meeting as fluid and cohesive as possible. And so our meeting is being broadcasted on SCTV this evening. And so we do expect respect in listening, and as well as a lot of participation from the audience members. We have allowing 1 person to speak at a time. We do know that there might be some strong feelings on this topic, but we are hoping for a place of dialogue, a place of honesty, and then just a place where there can be growth through communication. So after the introductory, our experts will be given time to speak. And while the experts and our panelists are talking, that is not going to be the time for questions and answering. That will follow their introductions. So we are welcoming of questions and comments tonight from the audience. This is a virtual public meeting, and so we are trying to replicate people lining up and going to the microphone. So if you have a question or comment, please use the raise hand feature or post that the raise hand feature that could be found in reactions, or if you right click, but use the right hand feature. We have Nicole, she's monitoring the screens. And so she will call on your name and you will be unmuted at that time when your name is called, so that you will be able to ask your question or make your comment. Again, we're reserving the questions and comments to 2 minutes per person. So please, we don't wish to have any disruptions. We don't looking for any inappropriate language or disrespectful conduct. We're trying to just have good civil discourse, which we know is possible even on this topic. So we do reserve the right to remove individuals from the meeting if that is needed. So in the unlikely event that this were to occur, you just have to watch the rest of the meeting on SCTV. And so our two experts for this evening, we have Dr. Susan Eaton, and she's an author and professor of practice and social policy and director of the Brandeis University Silliman Center for the Advancement of Philanthropy at the Heller School. Also, we have Professor Anika Singh Lamar. She's a clinical professor at Yale Law School, and they will each be given 10 minutes to speak at the beginning of our discussion here. Bill Rice also is the chair of the Simsbury Planning Commission. And so he has the 2020 Simsbury Affordable Housing Plan, which he will, I guess, go over a little bit. He's going to highlight of what is already occurring in Simsbury. Also, we have the First Selectman, Eric Wallman, to give introductory statements. And we have the Simsbury Deputy First Selectman, Sean Askham, who also will have some introductory statements to make. So we're open to audience questions to the elected town officials and experts. And so that being said, we'll go on. First, we will hear from Dr. Susan Eaton, who is she's a professor, American author, journalist, educator, scholar, and philanthropic advisor. She is a professor of practice and director of the Silliman Center for the Advancement of Philanthropy at the Heller School for Social Policy at Brandeis University. At the Silliman Center, Susan and her colleagues engage funders and their advisors, socially concerned scholars, and nonprofit practitioners to increase and enhance grant making to social justice causes. Susan is also the author of the 2020 report entitled The Steady Habit of Segregation, The Origins and Continuing Harm of Separate and Unequal Housing in Public Schools in Metropolitan Hartford, Connecticut. Following her will be Professor Anika Singh Lamar, and she is a clinical professor at Yale Law School. She teaches at the Community and Economic Development Clinic, which provides transactional legal services to organizations seeking to advance economic opportunity. CED's clients include affordable housing developers, community development, financial institutions, farms and farmers markets, fair housing advocates, and neighborhood associations. From 2007 to 2013, she represented for-profit, not-for-profit, and governmental clients engaged in a variety of real estate projects, including building affordable housing, remediating and redeveloping brownfields, and revitalizing urban neighborhoods. And so that is also Professor Anika Singh Lamar. So that being said, we are now going to move forward with our discussion. So the first voice you will hear is Dr. Susan Eaton, who will then be followed by Professor Anika Singh Lamar. So thank you, and let's give them our attention as they speak.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up. Okay, good. It's really great to be here. Thank you, and Cozy, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks for inviting me to be a part of this really important conversation. Thank you to the Spirit Council for arranging this as well. I also am honored to share the Zoom stage, so to speak, tonight with Professor Lamar, whose work in Connecticut I've really admired and watched from afar. So let me say first off that I am not here to tell you, the folks of Simsbury, what you should or should not do in the here and now. And I do know that this topic comes with controversy and disagreement, and perhaps some of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight will cause discomfort. But my hope is that I can provide some useful historical context to inform debate and policymaking and practice as part of what seems to be a very inclusive democratic process in your town, and of which I think this conversation is a vital component. So, as was just mentioned, in addition to books I've written about racial segregation and integration at the national level, I am author as well of this very lengthy and detailed recent report that explores a wide variety of mechanisms, structures, policy actions, and policy non-action and willful neglect that over more than a century contributed to the racial and socioeconomic segregation that characterizes the Greater Hartford region. So for the purposes of this panel, though, I'm going to focus on just two of those forces, which I think might be most relevant for you, if only because folks can actually do something about them now. The first is the state's allegiance to local control as it was expressed related to government subsidized housing. And the second, related to the first, and something I know there's been a lot of conversation about in the state, is zoning regulations. Zoning regulations that are fashioned by municipal governments and actually enabled by the state of Connecticut. Now, I'm going to ask all of us if we can imagine ourselves back in the late 1940s. It was a time during which Black and Latino migration to what was then a very prosperous Connecticut and a very prosperous Greater Hartford region, this migration was continuing at a very rapid pace. And the neighborhoods in Hartford where Black and Latino residents could secure often exorbitantly priced rental housing was becoming crowded and overburdened. And thus, one of the ways that the federal government responded to this problem, which was occurring in metropolitan areas in the Northeast and throughout the Midwest, was by offering money to states to build subsidized housing. But because in Connecticut, it was housing authorities in cities and towns as opposed to, say, a regional government that planned and built housing, it meant that subsidized housing would be built in places only where the local officials actually wished to build it. No municipality was required to build such housing. And overwhelmingly in your region, it was the city of Hartford that took on that responsibility and built housing for its residents. And thus, by the late 1960s, 94% of Greater Hartford region's low-income subsidized public housing would be located inside Hartford city limits. In the 10 surrounding towns at that time, just 1.3% of housing stock was public housing units. In 1967, there were some legislators who came together, mostly from the cities, who thought that they had come up with a good way to reduce this inequality and this growing segregation in the region. And they introduced a bill that would have created a regional housing authority. And this likely would have spread the responsibility for planning for and building housing for lower income families across regions of the state, greatly reducing economic and racial segregation. But this measure at the time was vehemently opposed by suburban local officials and by suburban state legislators. And since the legislature in the state is dominated by suburban interests, the bill ultimately died. So let's move on right into the 1970s. We've got ideas about regionalism basically dead on arrival at the State House. At that time, state agencies, different civil rights organizations, and even the federal government began to investigate the ways in which the actions of local suburban governments contributed to the racial and economic segregation and the attendant inequalities of opportunity within metro areas of the United States. And this included studies of Connecticut. So these researchers, investigators, zeroed in on what came to be termed exclusionary zoning. And a little bit of background first. The power to regulate zoning is reserved to each state under the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, right? So when we're having this conversation, zoning is local in nature and it's practiced locally in Connecticut, but it's actually states that have the power to determine whether and to what degree and precisely how to grant municipalities power to shape and influence land use. And in 1978, and this was a time of continuing suburban growth in the region, a report commissioned by the state of Connecticut itself concluded that Connecticut's suburban governments typically overall excluded low-income families, disproportionate shares of whom are either Black or Latino, through zoning. And specifically, they found that 1, Publicly assisted housing is largely concentrated in the state cities. Affordable housing is, quote, largely absent in wealthier jurisdictions. And 3, when low income or affordable housing is built in suburban communities, it is disproportionately reserved for elderly households. So mostly this exclusionary zoning was accomplished and still accomplished in a lot of places through local regulations that make it difficult, if not impossible, to build multifamily housing, which is typically the most economical way to build any type of affordable housing. In the greater Hartford region, the city of Hartford has long had the most what is called inclusionary zoning, along with a handful of other urban communities and some inner ring suburbs. Contemporary assessments indicate that this is pretty much largely still the case. So I'll close by saying that it's important to understand that focusing on these two forces, as important and malleable as they are, also leaves a lot out. So I ask you just for a moment to try to widen the lens, right? You've got this information, and appreciate that the harms that local control through exclusionary zoning and through the lopsided siting of affordable housing, subsidized housing, were at the time and still are, right, greatly compounded over multiple generations by private racial discrimination among landlords, by racial discrimination by banks, by racial discrimination by realtors that steered would-be homeowners to neighborhoods based on race, by racial discrimination by insurance companies who, with headquarters oftentimes based right in Hartford, refused to write policies for homeowners in Black and Brown communities within the city. And in 1968, after passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, in 1968, the federal government passed the Fair Housing Act that made racial discrimination in housing illegal and put forth numerous protections. But after 1978, there's been ample documented evidence, and you can read about it in the report. But this was throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and through the 2000s. That discrimination continued and that the Fair Housing Act was simply not adequately enforced by state regulators who have an affirmative duty to provide equal protection of the laws. It's also crucial to consider here the harms of government-established practice of redlining that since the 1930s and afterward, inflated values of homes in Greater Hartford's white neighborhoods while devaluing homes and thus encouraging disinvestment in racially diverse neighborhoods and in Black and Brown communities. And there's a local scholar, Jack Doherty, who I'm sure some of you know, who's done phenomenal work around this in recent years. And 2, we must also keep in mind that all of this was happening as federal government-backed mortgage loans were accelerating growth and investment in newer suburban communities like Simsbury, like Glastonbury, like West Hartford. And as white residents took advantage of these excellent mortgage terms to buy homes in highly valued suburban communities, rampant housing discrimination during that time prevented even African Americans and Latinos who had the financial means to do so from moving there. And so, for more information about the ways that these actions and these trends contributed and continue to contribute to a host of racial disparities and unequal opportunities, I highly recommend the work of the Open Communities Alliance and reports from the Connecticut Fair Housing Center over the past 5 years that give you a really good look into what the impact and harms of these actions compounded and the segregation compounded over years through policies and different mechanisms have in the present day. And then, of course, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Richard Rothstein's excellent book, The Color of Law, which really provides a national perspective. And my report was meant to take that look at that book and that framing of that book and bring together the research that's been done over many, many decades to tell a more granular story about what's happened here in the Greater Hartford region. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to any comments or questions that any of you might have. Thank you.
Okay, should I jump right in? I've been asked to focus on solutions, and I will, I promise. But unless you really know the scale of the problem, every solution seems reasonable. So So I'm going to zoom out for a second first, and even before I do that, going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay, great. Does everybody see a slide that says housing equity? Excellent. Okay. So land use and zoning can be pretty wonky. So I oftentimes like to start these conversations with an anecdote, which is not my anecdote. It comes from Isabel Wilkerson's wonderful book, The Warmth of Other Suns, about the Great Migration. That time period that Susan referenced, where states like Connecticut and other states in the northern part of the country welcomed, oftentimes not very kindly, large numbers of African American migrants from the southern part of the United States between the 19-teens and the 1940s. And in that book, she tells a story of a doctor. When she's interviewing him, he is in Los Angeles, very successful surgeon, but he's telling her about his childhood in the small town of Monroe, Louisiana. And he describes being raised in that town by two Black school teachers. So, I'm sure woefully underpaid, but nevertheless somewhat middle class. So they had access to resources and funds and whatnot, but were confined to the Black part of town as a result of segregation. And one thing he bemoans about his childhood, that she's talking to him as a highly successful, wealthy surgeon in Los Angeles in the 1990s, and he's still remains so sad that he never learned how to roller skate. And he says to her that he never learned to roller skate because on a side of town, there were no sidewalks and the roads were dirt. And his parents could have afforded to buy him skates, but they couldn't afford to buy sidewalks. So I tell this to share an anecdote about what it means to tell people to rely on their bootstraps in a world where maybe you can afford skates, but you can't afford sidewalks. And in fact, ironically, maybe in a conversation about zoning, the earliest zoning codes were intended in part to ensure that only some people got access to sidewalks. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, local governments began to spend more and more money on local infrastructure, streetlights, sewers, sidewalks, and the like. And across the country, there was a desire by the politicians in charge of that decision-making, all white at this time period, to limit that investment to white neighborhoods. And one of the ways they did that was through zoning. And this is a great book by Jessica Trunstein called Segregation by Design, came out about 2 years ago, that documents this sort of fact. Today, the infrastructure that zoning serves to segregate is largely schools. If you think about the primary thing that local government is spending money on, and the desire by people in charge to ensure that, well, if we're going to spend a lot of money on something, I really only want to spend it on me. I don't want to spend it on them. So how do I create policies that will allow me to do that? And that's what zoning does. So zoning makes it hard to build housing, but it also segregates the public resources, and it segregates public resources that are really fundamental to economic opportunity. So how does it do that? We're going to talk. I'm going to talk in a minute, as I'm transitioning to talking about solutions, about the elements of zoning codes that are exclusionary. But the most fundamental thing that exclusionary zoning does is that it requires the purchase of a lot of land for a small number of units of housing. And if you can't spread out the cost of land over multiple units of housing, then you're building in an automatic price, basically an automatic pricing of the housing. So it's as if I told you that in order to buy a car, you must use 4 tons of steel. Is exactly what it's like to say, if you want to buy a house, you have to also buy 2 acres of land. And if I told you that in order to buy a car, that car had to have 4 tons of steel, it would make your car less efficient, worse for the environment, and you'd have less choice about what kinds of cars you could own. And in fact, we do the same exact thing in housing. And the results, when you layer that onto a lot of the history that Susan just described, plus an enormous through today income and wealth gap between white families and other families in this country, is racial segregation. This is a more recent paper that looks at California cities, and you can see that after controlling for various factors, they were able to correlate single-family zoning with higher numbers of white households. And they also, importantly, as I'll talk about when I get to solutions, found that that citizen participation in opposition to housing applications also drove exclusion. Finally, another recent paper from Jessica Trunstein, which finds that whiter communities in the 70s adopted more exclusionary zoning, and that on top of that, that exclusionary zoning worked over time to maintain the homogeneity of those. So what is it about zoning codes that's exclusionary? And then these are the problems that, well, they have to get tied to the solutions. There's no solutions without problem identification. Large lot zoning, single family zoning, any kind of discretionary approvals process. So if in your town you force a multifamily development to go through citizen participation, discretionary approvals, public hearings, you're going to see less housing, you're going to see more parking. I'll talk a little bit about the details of that in a second. Another common component of exclusionary zoning are duplicative regulatory regimes. And by that, I mean, in the state of Connecticut, for example, we have a public health code that governs septic systems. But a lot of zoning authorities seem to think it's also their job to worry about septic systems. And that's like, overlapping regulatory regimes that just erect barriers to development. So what is it that single family zoning prohibits? This has become kind of very common graphic borrowed from a planning firm that developed this concept of middle housing, missing middle housing. Contemporary zoning codes tend to accommodate detached single family houses. Although, as one of my students pointed out last year when I showed this slide, in Connecticut, you can't build the houses this close together. I'll talk about that in a second. But most contemporary zoning codes permit detached single family houses. And they, in the cities anyway, permit this kind of mid-rise apartment building. But almost nowhere outside of Connecticut cities permits what's in the middle here: duplexes, triplexes, townhouses. And what's really sad about that is that's historically pre-zoning where affordable housing came from. Naturally occurring, unsubsidized affordable housing. I'm sitting here in New Haven in my vertical townhouse built in the 1860s. That is our historic development pattern in New England, and we just don't do it anymore. The other piece of this is large lot. So this is from a colleague of mine, Bob Alexson, we are politically opposite. He's on the right and I'm on the left, but we agree on this very deeply. He's been talking about this for decades, one of the pioneering scholars of exclusionary zoning. If you require single family houses to be built on enormous lots, then those houses are going to be very expensive. For the last few years, he's been doing surveys of zoning codes in Greater New Haven, focusing on the suburbs, Silicon Valley, and then the suburbs of Austin, and has found that even as compared to Silicon Valley, which is like some of the most exclusionary zoning in the country, it's like the epicenter of exclusionary zoning in Silicon Valley. In Connecticut, we our codes are remarkably more stringent than Silicon Valley's are in terms of what we require in terms of minimum square footage to build a house. And you can see from these numbers here that just nowhere in the country zones as much land as the state of Connecticut does for housing that has to be on more than an acre or even more than 2 acres. It's just mind blowing. And actually, in a couple minutes, I'm going to talk to you about a fair housing case out of Arizona, where the fight was over whether the minimum lot size ought to be 6,000 square feet or 8,000 square feet. Only 3.6% of land in suburban New Haven can you build a house on less than 10,000 square feet. I mean, that's it's extremely exclusionary. The timing of this matters too. Think of what Susan told you about what was available to an African-American family, even middle-class family that could afford roller skates, right? In the 40s and 50s in Connecticut. So we have this era, this building boom era, where in nearby Avon, for example, you can build a house on 15,000 square feet. That's less than half an acre, right? An acre is about 40,000 square feet. Well, that zoning gets more and more restrictive over time. And by the time the Fair Housing Act passes in 1968, so even in a perfect world where it was perfectly enforced, that Black family in Hartford could have, in theory, moved to Avon. Well, by the time the Fair Housing Act passes, Avon zoning no longer permits the development of starter homes, right? So that context and that timeline it matters. And I'm picking on Avon here, but this is true across the state and across the country. It's generally accepted that the 1970s are kind of the ballooning mushroom explosion of exclusionary zoning happens. And whether you think it's a coincidence or not, that's also exactly when the Fair Housing Act goes into effect. Okay, so I told you that one of the hazards of exclusionary zoning is discretionary approvals processes. And almost no towns in Connecticut permit multifamily housing as of right outside of the cities. So what happens when you don't permit a development as of right and you force people to go through, apply for variances or plan development approvals, special exceptions, special permits, et cetera? Everyone's like, yay, democracy, like you can come out and share your opinion about the thing or whatever. Well, unfortunately, what happens in these meetings is actually quite predictable. And I just want to describe for you two relatively recent, in the last 5 years, federal court cases that have found that the kinds of things that people routinely say in these land use hearings are actually violations of the disparate treatment prohibition in the Fair Housing Act. This is out in Nassau County, where I grew up, Garden City, very white town surrounded by majority minority towns considering an affordable housing application. And the court found that when people talked about character and flavor and keeping Garden City what it is and crowding in an upscale neighborhood, and this is why I left Queens, that those actually were, it's not rock science, that those things are evidence of racial discrimination. Another case from the Ninth Circuit, this is the Arizona case, where the court found, look, like, we get that people are smart enough not to say that they don't want Latino people living in their neighborhood. But when people start talking about large families and unattended children and parking and crime, like, again, I think we all lived through the Trump era. We can see through those words and know exactly what it is that people are talking about. I like to just, if I'm going to talk about Arizona and Long Island, I ought to pull a couple of Connecticut examples. And I just pull these. This is out of Greenwich. This is a auto body shop that was being proposed to be replaced by an apartment building. People thought the apartment building was somehow uglier than the auto body shop, I guess. I don't know. But you can see that the kinds of things that people say are exactly what the courts have found to be evidence of racial discrimination. It's the very, very concerned elderly white gentleman who's very unhappy about balconies, I guess, for this apartment building. And this is closer to here, Middlefield, very similar thing. This is just out of a newspaper story. Middlefield Housing Authority trying to propose multifamily development, and you have people saying things like, look, if you live in Middlefield, that means you want to live near nice people, not apartments, because they see those two things as mutually exclusive. And this is not at all surprising. The social science tells us that across the board, not just here in suburban Connecticut, that when you open up public hearings like this on housing, on multifamily housing applications, that the audience is generally whiter, older, wealthier, and more than the average citizen opposed to the construction of affordable housing. So predictably, that opposition results in fewer units, fewer affordable units, and more parking. People think local control because we know our neighborhood, but the social science tells us that across the board, everyone demands the same thinking things. And the people who show up to the public hearings, and I go to a lot of public hearings, so I'm making fun of myself here as much as anyone else. The people who go to the public hearings are not like normal representative people. They're oftentimes quite extreme viewpoints, and oftentimes. So I also want to just very briefly turn back to the roller skates. Exclusion doesn't just mean exclusion from places, it also means exclusion from staff. And this is just out of a Brookings report from a few years ago that tied exclusionary zoning and school test scores, and found that where the zoning was more, where the school test scores gaps were higher, the zoning was also more exclusionary, and Connecticut was at the top of the list on both of those things. We have the largest achievement gap, we all kind of know that. We also have the most exclusionary zoning, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so one thing that's sort of one solution is simply to take out that those discretionary approvals processes. Somewhere in town, probably throughout your town, you should be permitting multifamily housing as of right. Section 8-2 of the Connecticut General Statutes, that's our Zoning Enabling Act, requires every town to permit multifamily housing somewhere. Most Connecticut towns are in blatant violation of that. I have a pending application in Woodbridge where we are making that case right now. But as a general matter, a best practice here is simply to permit multifamily housing as of right, and don't let it go through that discretionary approvals process where you know exactly what people are going to say. In addition, a best practice here is to remove those people say those code words in the hearings, but oftentimes those code words are also in the code, talking about character and flavor, whatever, those things. Those subjective terminology should really come out of you shouldn't have subjective terminology in a statute. I wouldn't want you to decide whether the color of my car is pretty, and we also shouldn't be doing that for land use stuff. So another best practice here is to design the rules so that it is possible to build what we call starter homes. We talked about what single family only zoning prohibits, and the idea here is to permit this stuff in the middle, duplexes and triplexes and townhomes and the like. And we don't in Connecticut. So I picked on Avon earlier. I'll pick on Guilford now. The state statute requires every town to zone for multifamily housing. Here on the left is the town of Guilford. I've had to zoom in really, really tightly to even get to a place where I could point to the tiny, tiny neighborhood in Guilford where you're allowed to do 2-family houses, and nowhere in Guilford are you allowed to do multifamily as of right. And again, I'm picking on Guilford, but that's just typical across the state of Connecticut that suburban zoning codes are out of compliance. So one best practice here is to simply permit small multifamily everywhere you permit single family. The city of Minneapolis, it went into effect about a year ago, now permits, depending on where you are, 6 units or 4 units. 6 units or 3 units on every single family lot. So a single family house can be a 3-family house, provided you meet the other parameters of the code. This whole state of Oregon has done the same thing. So you can do that on a local level, or at the state level you can. And in Oregon now, there's no more single family zoning. There's duplex zoning and there's 4-family zoning. It's not to say that it's giant scale, but single family zoning has been banned in the entire state of Oregon. And I should say that those are not the only ones. So just in the last week, Sacramento did this, and Berkeley's considering it now. Berkeley's particularly historic because Berkeley is the birthplace of single family zoning. And the reason they birthed it was because they couldn't figure out how to effectuate racial segregation in the 1920s after the Supreme Court had decided that you couldn't have explicitly racially segregatory zoning codes. Another best practice here would be to have the state require that every local government zone for its fair share of affordable housing, where you would do a calculation related to growth and opportunity and infrastructure and really set a number for every town to get to. Sorry. Okay. I just want to sort of show a slide. This is what it would. This is a house in Guilford today. This is the 4-family house that we're trying to build in Woodbridge right now. You can see the McMansion's way bigger than our anticipated 4-family house, and our anticipated 4-family house looks like a single-family house. It's doable and fine. Everyone's going to be okay, I promise. Another possibility here is this is sort of a townhome model, but it's not just townhomes, it's also modularity. So this is here in New Haven. These were all built as single-family townhouses in 1865. As the neighborhood changed over time, the use changed too. So if you go back to the old fire insurance maps for the block that I live on, you'll see that in the first decade of the 20th century, these are all single-family houses. That's on the left. But by the 1930s, these have all, actually, some of them have been turned into rooming houses. And the apartment building next door is a doctor's office. And on the other side, of the rooming house, there's apartments. Allowing for that kind of flexibility and change over time allows the market to kind of do what it does, which is to meet the desired needs of people who are looking for housing. And I'll say that as the market has shifted over time, again, this old rooming house got turned back into a single family house in the 80s, right? So allowing those shifts, I think, is really important, particularly when you're in a state with an aging population that may not want a 3,500 square foot house in the suburbs, but maybe would want a 1,000 square foot apartment and a 2,500 square foot unit to rent out. This is a single family house also here in New Haven, although just kidding, it's not, it's a 2-family house. And again, that's just the kind of thing that can happen when your code is more flexible and not so inflexible as to permit people from building an apartment unit that they can rent out and serve the need of a renter and serve the need of the homeowner in terms of income, et cetera. So another best practice here is ADUs. This accessory dwelling units. This graphic is actually from a publication from the state of New Hampshire, which mandates every town in New Hampshire is required to permit accessory dwelling units. And this is just showing you how accessory dwelling units can go. They can go in the attic, they can go in the garage as a garage conversion, over the garage. I mean, you can really do these any different way. They're all utterly consistent with Connecticut's character and flavor and what have you. Again, this is sort of how we historically did affordability before we broke the world through exclusionary zoning. And there's a bunch of states that require every town in the state to permit ADUs. Oregon, again, makes an appearance. New Hampshire, California. This has become very common. There are some towns in Connecticut, suburban towns, that can permit ADUs. They're oftentimes on their face very restrictive. So they might require that the ADU be occupied by a family member, or they might cap the square footage of the ADU at 600 square feet. Or they might say the ADU can hold no more than 1 bedroom. That's all bogus. Like, if you're going to do this, do it right. Give people flexibility. Allow the ADU to be occupied by a family. If you're like me and what you're worried about in terms of housing segregation is segregated access to resources, then you ought to be building affordable housing for families. That's who ought to have access to Simsbury schools, right? So that's another, really should be a governing, I think, feature of thinking about what inclusivity means. It's been interesting in Woodbridge to hear testimony in favor of our proposal from Amity High School students who just wish they hadn't spent 13 years of their education in entirely white schools. It is really interesting. Thinking about how to do these things for families, I think, is really key. So I just want to end by saying none of these things is a slam dunk. This is kind of a great quote from the head of Achievement First, which is a charter school organization in New Haven and New York and Bridgeport and Hartford. And he's talking here about school segregation, but I think it applies equally well to housing segregation, that the tools we use to create the segregation are just so much bigger than the tools we've ever used to try to address it. And it's not so much that desegregation efforts have ever failed, it's that we've never tried. And I have to say this because I feel kind of stupid if Susan made her presentation and I made my presentation, and then I told you could solve this with ADUs. I mean, you can't. The problem is bigger than that, but we all have to start somewhere. So I say that. And again, the other thing I just want to end with is saying that this really is about kids. It's about what kids have access to what resources in the Connecticut that we've built today. And every child wants well-built schools, and every child wants libraries that are well-resourced, and every child wants parks. That's my baby girl, and parks that are well-maintained and well taken care of and accessible. And every child and their family deserves access to quality transportation infrastructure. Those are my two boys. And so long as we permit this state to go down the track it's going, we are living in a world where we know by design, we are ensuring that some children have access to resources and others don't. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Anika, for a very in-depth presentation. Next, we're going to hear from the Commissioner of Zoning, the elected chair of the Simsbury Planning Commission. We're going to hear from Bill Wright. So, Bill, you have the floor now.
Okay, and Cozy, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Right, okay, good. Yeah, thanks. I am the chairman of the Simsbury Planning Commission. The commission has a constituency of 6 regular members and 3 alternates that can fill in the case of an absence of a regular member. I think it's important to point out that we are all, although we are elected, we are volunteers, which in some cases may mean we are not experts at everything that we may be dealing with. However, we do have certain levels of expertise, and we try to bring that to each meeting. About this time last year, the commission had a little workshop to determine what we would put our resources towards in 2020. And it was pretty unanimous that the commission wanted to create the affordable housing plan for Simsbury. We were made aware that it was something that's statutorily required. I think Connecticut General Statute Section 8-30J requires that each municipality prepare an affordable housing plan in the event that they don't meet the 10% requirement of housing stock in the town meeting the affordability criteria. And I think Nkosi said earlier, Simsbury is about 4.74% of our housing stock qualifies for affordable under Connecticut General Statute 8-30G. So we started to brainstorm some ideas. We knew we wanted to put together a plan. We knew that none of us had professional experience with this. So the first thing we did was assemble published affordable housing plans from several other towns in Connecticut. And we felt that we could probably use one of those as a template or a starting point for our plan. Ultimately, we decided to model our, at least the structure, if not the content so much, after, I think, Ridgefield. It just seemed to flow kind of the way we were thinking on the commission. We did have a couple listening sessions where we invited members of the public to share their thoughts with us. And it became apparent at that time that expectations by some of the people in the public certainly exceeded what the commission had anticipated to be in the affordable housing plan. So we mulled this over for a while, and then I asked that town leadership and myself get together. And what we ultimately decided to do was publish the affordable housing plan as we had drafted it, which does, a little bit to move us in the direction of more affordability. I know that one of the targets that we have is to increase the percentage of affordable housing in Simsbury by 1 percentage point over 5 years. And I know that was met with a lot of, probably shock to some of the members of the public, but we were looking at it from a very pragmatic standpoint, without doing wholesale changes to zoning regulations and other exclusionary practices. 1 percentage point increase in affordable housing equates to 90 housing units. Now, I don't know about you, but 90 new housing units in Simsbury to me is quite a bit. I think it's possible to do that in 5 years, but people were talking 10% in 1 year and things like that, and it's just not something that the commission was comfortable putting in the plan. So the one thing that really has changed between the time that we presented the plan to the public earlier in 2020 was a kind of a request or an action item to the Board of Selectmen to consider developing a task force or another group of people, perhaps enlisting the help of a professional to maybe expand upon the affordable housing plan that's been developed right now. So we are just about ready to submit it to the Board of Selectmen. I think there's one last go around I have with one of the town staff, and then we'll be submitting that to the Board of Selectmen. So I think the commission has, done a noble job in trying to satisfy the requirements of the statute, but I'm not convinced that the plan is going to really fulfill the expectations of some of the townspeople. So we felt that it needs a little more attention. We left the door open to expand it, but we also took advantage of creating the plan and meeting our obligation relative to the statute. That's kind of the philosophy. I don't want to get into many details because that just goes down the rabbit hole. But certainly excited to hear what people on this Zoom meeting have to say. So thanks.
All right. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. And so next we're going to hear from Simsbury First Selectman, Eric Wellman. And then following him, we're going to hear from the Simsbury Deputy First Selectman, Sean Askham.
All right. Thank you, Antosi. I want to thank the Spirit Council for inviting me to be part of the panel tonight. The Let's Talk series has been incredible. And I know that there's a lot of new people on this Zoom meeting who haven't been part of other past discussions, and I hope you can join because they have been amazing. I'm glad that many members of our Board of Selectmen could be here tonight. Deputy First Selectman Sean Askham, who's on the panel, also Wendy Maxtudis, Jackie Batos, and Chris Peterson. Before addressing the specific issue at hand tonight, affordable housing, I just want to take a quick step back and give some context about our board's interest in equity, diversity, and inclusivity more generally. One of the blessings of serving as First Selectman has been the opportunity to learn and hear about people's lived experiences that are different than my own. In the 3+ years that I've served as First Selectman, our board has had to grapple with difficult truths that Simsbury may not be the fully welcoming, accessible, inclusive community that we strive to be, at least not for everyone. And that's a big reason why we formed the Spirit Council. And one of the first jobs of the Spirit Council is going to be gathering data, because if you can't measure a problem, you can't fix a problem. And it's why in 2019, our board championed an LGBTQ art installation in one of the most public spaces in our town. It's why we partnered with the nonprofit A Promise to Jordan to become a recovery-friendly community. It's why we partnered with our Aging and Disability Commission and the AARP as we seek to become an age-friendly community. It's part of the reason why we invested in have been investing in our sidewalk infrastructure to ensure that it's ADA compliant, and why we've championed diverse voices and perspectives on our volunteer boards and commissions. So when we talk about affordable housing, it's an issue of equity, because at the heart of the issue is access to one of the best public school systems in the state, even the country. It's access to one of the safest communities in our state. But just like the Spirit Council is being thoughtful and strategic in how it gathers data, I think we need to be equally clear and thoughtful in what it is we're asking for and what it is we're solving for when it comes to affordable housing. We've talked a little bit tonight about 830G, which is a very narrow definition of affordability. So are we talking about increasing the supply of homes that you can buy for under $250,000, which I was surprised to learn myself make up more than a third of our housing stock? Are you talking about low income housing, which is quite different than 830G? Also, I think we need to be clear on what the end goal is. Is the goal to ensure that teachers and police officers who work in Simsbury can afford to live in Simsbury? Is the goal to improve economic diversity more broadly? Or is the goal to improve racial diversity? I think all of these things are laudable goals, but they may carry somewhat different solutions. So I look forward to your questions tonight. I particularly look forward to learning from you and the other panelists. But most importantly, I want you to know that I'm very open to discussing specific ideas and proposals that are within the control of the board that I serve on, the Board of Selectmen, that can make Simsbury a more inclusive place to live.
Eric, eloquent as always. It's always a hard act to follow. Everybody can hear me as well?
Got you.
All right. Again, I'm Sean Askham. I'm honored to be the deputy first selectman. And just a quick point, Eric, the first selectman, he's a Democrat and I'm a Republican. We're a pretty rare pair in the state of Connecticut and probably the country, in that we're an example where the two parties actually get along and solve problems together. That doesn't mean Eric and I agree on everything, but we get in a room and we figure it out and we do it civilly, as does the rest of our board. So, with that, I've had the honor of being on this board for about a decade, and my affordable housing knowledge is limited to that experience and what I've read and learned through applicants and process along the way. Additionally, familial connection. My mother was on zoning for roughly 20 years, and did decide upon many of the applications that we might be talking about from an historical standpoint. So, just a little bit of a quick history lesson from the perception of somebody that lived, grew up in the town, and has served as a volunteer. First and foremost, the state statute is flawed in its construct. It's very well intentioned, but it is inherently flawed. The deed restrictions can often, in my opinion, be prohibitive to the track to affordable housing, in that the developers use this vehicle as an effort to bastardize and circumvent local zoning laws. Examples of that are the Meadowwood project that was approved ultimately by a court decision 10 years ago. We fought it on the grounds, and it was denied, I believe, on environmental concerns, because they were going to build roughly 300 houses with the minimum required affordable set aside to get it to trigger the statute to circumvent the local zoning laws. The developers didn't actually want to do local affordable housing. They used it as a mechanism to force an approval for a development that didn't conform to the zoning. At the time, it wasn't an entire affordable housing development. It was the minimum, again, to pass and to circumvent our zoning regulations. It ultimately was approved by the court. It's never been built because the economic forces didn't allow for it to be built, because we've got free market conditions. We've got the fact that somebody's got to buy the units that are approved and built. And that's been a challenge that we've seen not only in that project, but the Carson Way project itself was originally approved with a minimum set aside for affordability units. Again, those were deed restricted. We heard testimony at the Board of Selectmen, I believe 8 or 9 years ago, from banks, from the developer that took that property over, that it was simply no longer economically viable. They weren't able to sell those units and or build them due to those deed restrictions. And they ultimately asked the Board of Selectmen to lift those restrictions so that they could sell all of the units at the free market rate versus the deed restricted rate. On the Board of Selectmen, we did do that with a requirement for a payment to be set aside for future affordable housing in Simsbury. On the more positive side, we have approved the Ojekian property, which is on the north end of town that does provide affordable units in, I believe, their apartment units for those with emotional and physical disabilities. But Professor Lamar is exactly right. It has been biased towards either elderly or other, not intentionally, I don't believe, but that has the way it's done in town. But again, the challenge is we're not going to duplex our way to the solution here either. We don't exactly have a lot of land left to build in town. And we've got market conditions that I've seen, again, as an elected official, that don't allow for the units to be constructed and or sold. Another example, I'll give you the north end. There is an affordable component in those units, and the real estate agent and developer came to Eric and I early in Eric's term and asked us to help market those because they simply couldn't sell them. And they were really struggling with getting folks to buy those affordable deed restricted units. Again, coming up with the down payment of 20% was really challenging for folks. So again, statute well-intentioned, but state mandated ideas don't necessarily solve the affordable housing or inequity issues that I think are really eloquently and correctly brought up tonight. Eric pointed out we do have affordable housing units in town, and I don't feel the need to defend Simsbury. But I think it's as Eric's articulated than just do we have $175,000 houses, or do we have townhomes, or do we reduce quarter acre zoning to eighth acre or less, and then we can all look in each other's living rooms. But that doesn't necessarily solve the challenge right off the bat. We've also got to solve the what type of community do we want to be? Are we excluded from folks' list because they don't want to live here because there's a perception about us? I think it's a bigger issue than just affordable housing. So I am very much for anybody and everybody that wants to live in this community, that wants to be part of a community that cares about their kids and their schools and open space and our rivers and trails and people. And I agree very much with Professor Lamar that, it is about kids. It is about access. But we've got to do it the right way so that this isn't a one side or another. It's a let's figure this out. And Lloyd said it to me the other night. This is a human issue. This is a people issue. So I very much appreciated that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Eric and Sean. So what we're going to do now is we're going to open up the floor. We have about an hour. So we're opening up the floor to the audience for any questions that you might have, either directed to the elected representatives or to our panelists that have joined us, who also have a wealth of knowledge regarding this topic that we're discussing tonight with affordable housing. So the floor is open. You have the raise.
I'm going to ask people to use the raise hand feature. And Lindsay just needs a second to do something in the background with her Wizard of Oz technology there. We do want to say we encourage you to keep your camera on so that we can promote connection during our dialogue. So if your camera's off, if you could turn it on if you would like to ask a question. I'm going to start. The first two I see are Rebecca Hatch, and then I'm going to go to Kevin Beal. So Rebecca.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I'm Rebecca Hatch. I'm the rector of St. Albans Episcopal Church in Simsbury. I live in West Hartford, Connecticut. I'm sitting on the floor doing church crafts right now. So it's good to see everybody tonight. That's why I'm off camera. Thank you. I am wondering if perhaps Professor Lamar can talk a little bit too about the history connection between, and perhaps we see this in Hartford more than anywhere else, but housing that does actually have I guess ADUs, but they're designed for help, where you have servant quarters, and that's okay. But the minute you want it to be a 2-family or 3-family home, it's not okay. Can you talk at all about the history or what? I just get wind of it, but I don't know much about it. And wonder if you can provide more information there. Thank you.
I think you might be alluding to a couple of different things, and Susan probably can speak to some of this too. So historically, the deed restrictions that governed the sale and occupancy of housing in suburban communities that had what we call racial covenants, had an exclusion for the help. So they would say on their face, and Jack Doherty, who Susan mentioned at Trinity, has done a great job of documenting a lot of this in this region. They would say this house can never be sold or occupied to someone of and the following races. They would oftentimes include Blacks, Jews, it'd be a laundry list of who, okay. And then there would be an exception for the house. But if your servant is Black, then they can live there. Similarly, another thing that you might be alluding to that's related, that is really a related thing, and that I didn't talk about in terms of examples of exclusionary zoning are definitions of family. So if you zone for single family, then it begs the question of what's a family. And then the code's got to define family. And the libertarians in the room should be going a little nuts right now, like, oh my gosh, we let the law define what a family is. But we do. And then once you go down the path of letting the law define what a family is, then you end up in similar situations where you'll say, like, 2 or more blood relatives, or it might say people who eat together, people who share a household unit, people who budget together would be like a more flexible interpretation. But historically, these things would literally say 2 or more people who are blood relatives. They might even, some of the case law talks about grandparents and grandchildren, right? If you have a grandparent who's parenting, can they live with their grandkids without, in those definitions of family may also have an exclusion for the help, right? So single family, except that we'll let you have the help. So all of these things are reifying class distinctions. That's sort of what they're intended to do. So it's not at all surprising that whether you're talking about zoning or restrictive covenants, that they would make exceptions for the subservient class in that.
Okay, next I have Shannon. Oh, sorry, Kevin Beal, then Shannon. Kevin. Can you put your screen on, Kevin? There we go. Hey.
Yeah, sorry about that. Hey, everybody. So my question, in preparation for this meeting, Professor Lamar commented that you should be going to that Simsbury and reference the Meadowland purchase. And so I was wondering if some of the elected leaders could comment on the value of open space here in Simsbury, and then maybe Professor Lamar provide additional comment on that as well. Thank you.
Eric, you want to take that one, or you want to go? Or
why don't you start, Sean?
I think open space has been one of the pillars of the expectations of this community, and something that this town, longer than I've been alive, and many of us have invested in. I believe roughly a third of this town is currently preserved as either federal, state, or local open space. Back in the 50s and earlier, we were a farm community with a lot of forest land. The McLean Game Refuge is to our north. We've got the entire back Saddle Ridge property going into Town Forest, going into Stratton Brook, obviously Penwood and Talcott, on our borders. So, wildlife, the natural estuaries, the rivers, our Farmington River is designated wild and scenic by the federal government. So something that this town is very much held as part of its core, birthplace of Gifford Pinchot with the Pinchot sycamore. Again, I think it's, at least as I understand it growing up, it's part of the fabric of our community. And it's an expectation. And in some places it feels like it does conflict with what we're talking about here, affordable housing and housing in general, right? Folks have gone crazy, and I use the word crazy respectfully, but have been upset about the apartments that block the view of the ridge. Those are permissible under our zoning regs. Those are valid, approved. But they caused a lot of angst and consternation for folks that have lived in this town for a long time. But, that would be my comments on open space. I don't know, Eric, if you want to jump on there.
I just think that it's been unfortunate that with the Meadowwood acquisition in particular, it's been framed as a choice between affordable housing and open space. When the best information that I have is that affordable housing is unlikely to come to that parcel of land. And when I think about, more generally about affordable housing or denser housing or multifamily units, I think about locations that are, near sidewalks, near business districts, near public transportation, where it could, be a feeder into economic development if we're thoughtful about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Eric. I mean, for folks that might not know, the Meadowwood property is out in the fields of Squadron Line. So a good couple miles, I think, from the nearest sidewalk and or bus stop. So
I'm really glad you brought this up. And I did say that. Kevin's commenting on something I raised on Twitter last summer and then again today. So I'm going to say a couple things. So when I brought this up last summer, my initial reaction was about, I understand the value of open space. And my question was, for whom? Okay, so my understanding from the Hartford Business Journal article last summer was that the acquisition was funded in large part by the Trust for Public Land. Right around the same time they did that, or that article came out, the Trust for Public Land came out with a report about the dearth of park and open space opportunities for children growing in cities, not specific to Connecticut, but just in general. Children who grew up in Hartford today have some of the highest asthma rates in the country. If the Trust for Public Land is going to spend $4 million to do an open space acquisition, I don't know why they would do it in Simsbury. That's crazy to me. They are a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the charitable good. Not for nothing. I take a look at who's on their board, and as far as I can know, it's 100% white people. And not that surprising to me that their choice in terms of where to spend that money was with you all, instead of somewhere where it might have been, literally some of the highest asthma rates in the country. So yes, open space, one, for whom, and two, by whom. So does this national nonprofit owe it to the people of Simsbury to take hundreds of acres of land off the market, thereby inflating the cost of land across the board, right? So that's one question. Is by whom, for whom. A third thing that just always chafes for me when I'm talking about environmentalism with people in suburban Connecticut is that using up like an acre of land or 2 acres of land for your house is a choice. That's like a weird choice for an environment, right? Driving everywhere, like I walk to work, driving everywhere and not taking public transportation is like a really weird choice for an environmentalist to make. So to have people who have crafted their lives around driving everywhere, using up a ton of land for their own personal consumption, keeping their poop stored in their backyards, right? Those are like really weird. So then you tell me that you don't want affordable housing in community because of environmental concerns, I roll my eyes a little bit. I mean, maybe more than a little bit. I don't believe you. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing I'd say about the sidewalks and the proximity to bus stations and transit, and I agree with you. I mean, I live on a main road in a city, across the street from a public park, on a bus line. I walk to work. There are 2 train stations walking distance from my house. Those are all things that I have chosen that I care about. But I'm not going to tell poor people where to live, right? More than half of low-income people in the state of Connecticut own a car today. They might live in a place where there are sidewalks and transportation, but they probably don't work someplace where there are sidewalks and public transportation, because we've had astronomical job growth over the last 40 years in the suburbs, but no housing growth in the suburbs. So I'm not going to tell a poor person who we're already forcing to own a car because they're driving to a retail job at West Farms or something. Now, I'm not going to tell them they should live somewhere where they don't have to have a car, because we've already told them that they have to have a car, because we've grown jobs in the suburbs, but we have not grown housing in the suburbs. I could talk about this, a lot, but I'll leave it at that.
It's all fair points. If I could just jump in from the Meadowood. So remember, this project's been approved and had multiple extensions for, I think, a decade now. And it has not been built because it's not economically viable. This isn't Simsbury not wanting the affordable housing. This is the market and the developer aren't doing it. This has nothing to do with the people of this town, the government, or otherwise. It's a court mandated, whether we approved it or not in the past, it's court mandated that it's a development that can come, and it hasn't because the market doesn't support it. So again, if the developer wanted to resubmit, they've chosen not to as the landowner because it's not viable for them as a company.
Yeah. So I will tell you right now that the town of Orange is considering purchasing a country club in order to avoid having it redeveloped. There's nothing environmentally good about a country club. Town of Woodbridge did the same thing about 10 years ago. So this is just part of and Bob Alexson, who I mentioned earlier, who has documented a lot of the exclusionary zoning. And again, we're politically different, but we definitely come together on this. It's part of a pattern and practice across the state of well-off towns taking land out of the marketplace rather than see it developed. You're right, this Simsbury development may never have happened, but there are plenty of developments that could have happened where there were viable applications pending. Branford has done this, Woodbridge again. They across the state. So it's pattern and practice. And my primary objection when I brought this up last summer was the participation of custom public lands.
Thank you. Next, we have Shannon. Shannon Knoll. Let me unmute you. Oops. Sorry, Lindsay.
Okay. Hi, good evening, everyone. And thank you so much to the Spirit Council for holding this very important discussion. One thing, I'm sure anyone who knows me is not going to be surprised when I bring this up, but in the course of this discussion and discussions with Desegregate Connecticut, and I do serve on the zoning commission as an alternate in town, there is almost no mention of disability and the disability community. And that community plays into the equation of affordable housing. Disability does not discriminate based on race, income, gender, sexual orientation, education level. It does not discriminate at all. So I'd like to be able to understand, Professor Lamar, what your thoughts are about including the disability community in affordable housing plans moving forward. I was really happy to hear that the Planning Commission has indeed taken constituent recommendations to heart in forming a task force, because I do think that while we are volunteers, as the chair pointed out, we do not have the expertise to bring everything to the table that I think needs to be brought. So I'm very encouraged to hear that. But anyway, back to my original question, Professor Lamar, if you could address the needs of the disability community, which are perhaps not as straightforward as others. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was going to say three things. So the first thing is that just today, so I haven't read it yet, I always forget, it's a really long acronym, and it's the Fairfield County Council on Housing Opportunity or something like that. Literally today came out with a report on housing need, including accessibility issues in the state of Connecticut. So I will try before we disband to find the link to that and stick it in the chat. And I can't speak to the substance because I haven't read it yet, but it came out today. Two, I think one problem that arises when you kind of freeze your built environment in place, as we have throughout most of Connecticut, is you end up freezing in place an older built environment, which most of which predates the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is obviously a problem for accessibility. I'll give you an example right now. I'm working on a matter in Branford. I represent Branford Housing Authority. I know somebody in the chat described me as a New Haven lawyer, but I do work across the state. I am able to cross town lines. And we have the plans with 50-unit development that is elderly and disabled, occupied by elderly and disabled, studios and very small 1-bedrooms. And one of the reasons they're looking to redevelop it is because it's pre-ADA. And at the land use hearings, because we have to seek land use approvals to tear down this decrepit, falling apart pre-ADA 50-unit development and replace it with 67 units of 1-bedroom and 2-bedrooms that would be accessible, the head of the Tenants Association described having a disability and on bad days not being able, he can't get his wheelchair into the room, it doesn't accommodate it, and he's got to crawl into the bathrooms to use the facilities. Despite his very valiant and courageous and emotional testimony, Branford still saw fit to deny us twice and force us to go to 830G twice, and we finally won for finally last month. So we're excited about that. But when you kind of freeze in place a built environment that is old, you're also freezing in place inaccessibility. Whereas the new development there will be elevatored and accessible in 1-bedrooms and 2-bedrooms that are accommodating as opposed to 200 square foot studios, which are there right now. The third thing that you do see across the country, unfortunately, and there's some pretty bad examples of litigation around this, is people who do have means. So it's not an affordable housing issue, but people who do have means trying to retrofit in order to accommodate family members with disabilities and getting turned down because the land use boards don't think it's safe. There was a terrible case out of Chicago last year, for example, along those lines where the family thankfully won that case, but the neighbors put them through the rigmarole. And finally, in terms of participation and planning, I mean, I think you're exactly right. I think every community that is affected ought to be at the table in terms of thinking about these issues. And I do some work with Kathy Flaherty in that. I mean, there are different people who I work with who I value, and I would be open to working with any number of more people whose opinions I'm sure I would also value. So I appreciate you bringing those issues to the fore.
Can I jump in just for a second? Yeah, I really appreciated that question. It's very important, and oftentimes, the needs of people with disabilities and the needs of people who earn low incomes and the need for more racial diversity kind of get separated off. But I think what's really important is that, and your question really surfaces this, is the need for everybody, as Professor Lamar says, to be at the table together and working toward access. And sometimes access is going to look different for somebody with disabilities. It's going to look different for a low-income family. But I think that also when you bring up the issue of disabilities and in a conversation about zoning, it's important to remember that it was about 40 years ago that the state of Connecticut passed a law that ended local zoning exclusion of group homes, right, for people with intellectual disabilities, for childcare residential facilities, community residences for people who are receiving mental health care, halfway houses, people getting addiction services, and hospice facilities. And so it's really important to remember that, so that the state, when it wants to, when it sees as a priority, when it sees local governments doing things that it doesn't like, or it thinks it's wrong, or they think that it violates state law or violates federal law, they do have the ability to come in and pass a law. And I think that some of the advocacy, some of the incredibly effective advocacy among disability rights activists had a very important role in doing that. And that kind of should be surfaced and brought up. And in my research, I knew about the law and the change and all that, but there really weren't a lot of narratives or history about who was advocating to get that changed. And I think that that's an important thing to remember and to have as part of the story.
Thank you.
I've actually written on that, so we should talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are a couple of different buckets in which states have seen fit to intervene in local zoning authority across the board, one of which is group homes. And as you won't be surprised to hear, part of it has to do with federal funding. But we should, yeah.
Thank you. Next, we have questions from Carrie. Then I'm going to get to Chris, Margarita, and Gerald. So Carrie McKell.
Meckel.
Meckel, Harry Meckel. Thank you.
I'm also a lifelong Simsbury resident, and I have my JD from Quinnipiac University School of Law. And as a Simsbury resident, I think it's really just disingenuous when we talk about the history of segregation in this town, our own history of redlining. If you guys aren't familiar with it, the litigation against Simsbury Bank, which prevented a merger with a larger bank because of our history of redlining. I think it's really disingenuous when the first thing we bring up in response to talking about housing is open space. Why can't we talk about building more flexibility into our zoning laws? I think the first thing we do is put up roadblocks, and that's been something I've been seeing my entire life. My own family has a history of serving on various positions in town. I've served on volunteer committees as well, and it's just become this kind of automatic reaction. So I think if we really want to tackle this issue, let's stop talking about open space. Let's stop talking immediately about transportation or assuming what people need and start talking about something simple, like opening up flexibility for people to add accessory dwellings, for opening up the ability to have multifamily homes. You know, I care very much about environmental issues, and I love the fact that we have so much open space. But part of the reason why it's important to preserve open space is so that when our residents need more things, more like housing, it's available. So I just really want to highlight that. I don't know. I also kind of roll my eyes a little bit when I hear certain things like that because I'm just so used to it. It's a knee-jerk reaction. So I think if we really are serious about doing this, let's relook at our zoning. And that's my 2 cents.
Okay. Chris Peterson, let's move to you.
Am I unmuted yet?
You are unmuted.
Hey, everybody. Good evening. Nicole, Nkosi, you know what? I've always applauded you guys. You guys run such fantastic events and meetings. So it's never easy to be a referee, but you're doing a great job. So thank you. I felt that being an elected official as well, and we're going to that. It would be unfair not to express some of the things that are flowing through my head as the rest of the team on the board is likely going to be addressing this collectively. So it would be unfair for folks not to know where my head is as well, because we don't really have that many opportunities to really share thoughts on this issue. We haven't yet. So just what I've been thinking. I'm not going to really pose a question because I don't really want a debate around it or hear another person's opinion yet, because I just want to share what people have, what I'm going to be thinking about. And a little bit of background. My father and mom moved to town years ago. I don't even know, 60 something years ago. And my father came from an impoverished background, an immigrant impoverished background who lost the loss of income during the Depression. He lived in Hartford. And my mom, different immigrant background, was fortunate enough to survive her family to survive the Depression. But when they got married, they moved to Simsbury. Like they lived in Hartford, and they moved to Simsbury to experience something else and continue to move on the continuum, they felt, of the American dream, let's say, to a certain extent. I came back, and moved back, and I'm raising my family here, and part of the reason is the school systems, I think, was the reason why I've chosen to come back, which is many of the reasons why I think many of us are here. And we start, this conversation is around affordability. So what's going through my mind around affordability is also the concern of affordability for our current residents, not necessarily the folks who are yet to come. We're talking about that and how to solve for that. And that's incredibly important. And it's an imperfect situation. It's going to be very painful. And it's going to require dialogue, sacrifice, and commitments on people to make meaningful changes. And I applaud Bill Rice. You and your team, not easy. There's no perfect answer, but thank you for continuing to push us forward. But again, affordability, when I think about my own parents, my father's no longer with us, but my mom's 86. And through the career paths that they chose, and the incomes that they were bound to, likely at this point in their lives, they probably wouldn't necessarily be able to afford to still live in Simsbury, which is very much a concern, I think, for some of us in the older population. And when I saw that graphic of the one large home that could also have the multifamily superimposed on it, what went through my head was I would guess that that's a 5,000 square foot home or 7,000 square foot home, somewhere in there. The taxable square footage is exactly the same. But the one house has 2 kids, but the other one has 8 kids. And anybody who knows what we're talking about and facing in town coming up is an astronomical investment that we are about to undertake, and with no perfect number, no perfect dollar sign, to invest in our schools, to bring them up to just par to serve the current citizens, let alone the density that is moving into town for some of this high density development. So because of that, we have an affordability issue that we're facing, that we're grappling with today, whether it's going to be another police cruiser, whether it's going to be one of 3 new patrolmen, whether it's going to be a plow, whether it's going to be more sidewalks. This is an avalanche that's coming at us. It's going to be completely almost unsurmountable for our current residents, for affordability for them, let alone the concern of loading the town with additional residents who are going to need additional services from the school system. So that's one of the things I think that is going through my mind. I want people to also understand that the elected boards are also grappling with, as well as affordability and continued affordability for current residents. And as the future trends of our population town grow potentially, we're already burdening our taxpayers aggressively. We have to think about that, especially for seniors. And the last thing I'll say is, I don't think character, that bothers me that character is brought into it as being a dog whistle or code word, because I really like the character of my town and the way it looks when I drive through the center of it. And what I mean by the way it looks is I love the sidewalks. I love the historic buildings. I love the churches. I love the businesses are there. And love the people that are in my town, and love the people who are going to come to my town and visit my town. And I love the library. That's what I mean when I think about character. So that's my thoughts.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Margarita Albon, you're next up.
Can you unmute me? Okay. Oh, thank you very much. Anika, I'm the chair of the Greenwich Planning and Zoning Commission, and you mentioned us tonight, and I just thought I would respond a little bit to your comments. First of all, the project to which you referred was actually the site of an ironworks facility. The project was for 355 apartments, and it was denied because of a wetlands issue. And the wetlands issue was upheld in court, and it's now being modified for that. You do always hear in a town that has nothing that looks like a 355 unit building, you will hear concern from residents. And it's about finding a good balance, which unfortunately 830G doesn't always facilitate. In addition, we also, like Simsbury, are trying very hard to further our affordable housing. And we do have 2-family zoning as of right. We do have ADUs as of right. And we do have multifamily zoning along our commercial corridor. So although we were given as an example of typical suburban resistance, we are 22% non-white. And 20% of our school children are on reduced and free lunch. So although we only have 5% affordable housing, we have a huge need that we are continuing to strive to meet. And I just piped up. I'm actually here because my sister lives in town, so don't anybody hold it against her. But I just had to step in. I wanted to defend a little bit what Greenwich is doing, and that we certainly do not want to hold the poster child image up Thank you very much.
I won't respond because there wasn't really a question, but I just really want to briefly say 50% of Connecticut's public school children are not white.
Yeah.
50% of Connecticut's public school children are not white. And the numbers that people will throw out to say our town's diverse.
Right.
50% of Connecticut school children are not white.
I think ours is closer to right now. It's hard to know with COVID. Obviously, we're not tracking it as quickly, but I think we're running around 35 right now. We don't view ourselves as being comparable to the major urban centers in diversity, but I'm saying that we have a need and we do have some diversity and we're making an effort. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Gerald Lintner and Kate Beal after that. Gerald, thank you. There you go.
Hi, thank you. I'm Jerry Lintner. I want to go back to a couple things that Sean said, and actually Chris recently touched on those also. And maybe it is like very basic and very amorphous. Well, what both of them mentioned, Chris mentioned how he came here from his parents, when at this town, I'm assuming, was maybe in the years when it was not like the community, but like around the 50s, we really grew. And people came here who were finding a new opportunity and built what we have. Sean also mentioned children. And my concern is we've been here for a number of years. I've been involved in community things for like 30 years. And part of the reason we came here was the school system. It was so fantastic. But in fact, it was segregated, not by intent, but because the community had become unaffordable. So one of the things my wife and I were concerned about is what do we give our child? And one of the things we wanted her to see is this is not the world. And recently, working as volunteers on the old Drake Hill Flower Bridge, one of the people turned to me as we were working and said, you know, Jerry, we live in a bubble. And we do live in a bubble. And if we want to give a gift to our children, a legacy, and if we want to preserve a location where the people who built this community can still reside as they downsize, we need to do something about affordable housing so that this community becomes some reflection of what is evolving to be the reality, and our children do not live in a bubble, and they don't establish misconceptions, prejudices about people who, if they were invited in as families and children, would be their friends. And what they could share, think about it. A young child, if some of these shared with them as their friend, it would be so exciting to understand that and have that perspective. So I'm looking, and I have raised this before, maybe not in such an emotional kind of way, but to a number of elected officials whom I really respect. And I had recognized the huge challenge they have with multiple commissions, with different responsibilities that overlap, and how hard it is to achieve a united goal. One of the things that I did offer is, okay, we've talked about open space. That's one of the wonderful things about Simsbury. But with all the best intentions, we created in a lot of new developments little isolated backlots that we can't afford to maintain. And so I said, well, what if we could change the zoning so those backlots could be, I mean, they're not the most desirable because they're not on the street. So they would cost lower. And if developers then wanted to create like starter homes, downsizing homes, or the individual could afford a contractor to build this, this would have ongoing desirability for future people who come and live in Simsbury could then upscale. I understand that once you create public land, I've been told this repeatedly, there's no way to reverse it. Come on, guys. You know, look at how many laws nationally have been reversed as the need for a population has changed. So I'm Eric, Sean, zoning Bill. I don't know how we unify on this, but it is just a piece of the problem. And what I'm saying is we owe it to our seniors to give them an affordable place to downsize. And we owe it to our children, which is even more dramatic, to live in an environment that is not a bubble, but instead is a microcosm of the world. So they're prepared to move ahead. Thanks for the opportunity to go on. Go for it, Spirit.
Very well said as always, my friend. It's your point of us living in a bubble is exactly right to some extent. You know, my wife is a school teacher in Hartford, and we actually sent our daughter for her first 2 years when she was 3 and 4 to school there for exactly that reason, so she could experience the real world. So thank you. I appreciate your comments very much.
Great. That was great. Okay. Next we have Kate Beal and then Donna.
Hi. So I've been hearing a lot of talk and a lot of comparisons to like what's happening in New Haven. And I'm personally struggling with like comparing this more rural environment to a more, significantly more urban environment that is like New Haven, as a lot of the examples were given. And I was on the planning commission in Vermont. We lived there for about 10 years, and it was definitely a significantly more economically diverse community than is Simsbury. But I grew up in Simsbury and we relocated back here. And we were constantly at odds with trying to figure out how to regulate land use and not regulate it at the same time, right? Like we didn't want to overregulate and overburden people, make it so that they couldn't have those accessory dwelling units. That was always a topic of conversation. What do people do with farmlands when it's been passed down for hundreds of years, and then people want to subdivide that? That's their nest egg. That's their financial investment as a family, and they want to be able to do things with it. And of course, neighbors want to maintain that land. Vermont's a farming state, right? So this was always a topic of conversation, and just trying to make sure that people could really develop and get that economic security that they had invested in. And I think, so what I'm struggling with, looking at that rural community there and the economic diversity that we did have, and thinking about how it wasn't at all a city, it was rural Vermont, and thinking about Simsbury and how rural it is, and wondering if there's other places that we could look at for examples to kind of figure out how we navigate this. Like take Bloomfield over the mountain is definitely more suburban than say Hartford or New Haven would be. And have we done anything to compare what they've done there? Because they obviously have a lot more diversity there than we've welcomed here. And like, what are we doing differently here than they're doing there that allows them to develop in a more diverse way and that we're not? Anybody?
Eric, you want to take that one, or Bill?
Or? I'm not an expert. I'll be the first to say that. I think this goes back to my comment around let's make sure we're defining the problem that we're solving. Because if the issue is purely racial diversity, we know that there are people of color who live in Bloomfield, who live in West Hartford, who live in Hartford, who could afford to live in Simsbury, and for various reasons, and I don't claim to know what they all are, choose not to. And I think that that's something that's tough for this community to grapple with, is that we're not as welcoming a place to live as I think many people think we are, and certainly our Board of Selectmen wants to be. No doubt there are also other levers to improve the diversity of our community. But I think that there are other reasons other than price that keep people out.
Yeah, Eric, I would agree with that. I have peers and coworkers, friends across the racial, religious, age spectrum, and while we are very proud of our community, and I'll be the first one to defend it, we also do have a perception that many communities like ours have from the outside, that we are not as welcoming as perhaps we think we are. And that's something that frustrates me, and I don't like that. I don't see it, but I don't have that perspective that other people have. So I have a choice. I can dismiss it, or I can try to do something about it. And I think, Eric, what you're getting at is the same thing that I feel is, if we're going to compete for business and talent and intellect and arts and education and all the things that we value, then we ought to be the most welcoming place we can possibly be. Because I think that betters our community. You know, we talk about economic development, we talk about, the value of our schools, et cetera. And if there are ways that we can further supplement that through additional folks coming to this community, then we damn well better explore it as far as I see it. And that's going to make us uncomfortable. It's going to be different. It's much like when we get feedback at work or feedback in our personal lives that's unwelcoming or challenging. But again, we have that choice. We can dismiss it and do nothing, or we can try to figure it out. And then, again, I've been doing this a long time, and this discussion is more well attended and more thoughtful than any budget hearing I've ever been at. And we spend $100 million in the budget. So that's a pretty big darn number. So I'm encouraged by what's going on here tonight.
Great. And maybe we'll have more conversations as we figure out how to go forward, but this is an excellent forum to get people to have some input and then express some unique perspectives that they have, like Jerry's point about owing it to the seniors and to our children. That was a very interesting point. Donna, you're up next.
Hello. Thank you for putting this together. Backing up, I think Sean had a comment about the legislation and about how maybe it's not, that there are some issues that he has with it. And I would just ask that we try to worry about the intent and try to make it happen, in terms of affordable housing, making our community more available to different races. It's kind of ridiculous. I grew up in Ansonia. It was very diversified. And I think there is a different kind of diversity here, but obviously we're missing a large section in town. So it would be great. Any law, any legislation is human. It's going to have problems. So I just urge us to kind of get past that and figure out how to make it work regardless. And then Chris Peterson's comment about the increase in schools. I guess was never in on why is that giant apartment building across from Latimer Lane? And Bill Rice and his committee, they have a new proposal. And I think it's great that they're trying to figure out how to bring in affordable housing. But I guess my question is, how many new houses or apartments went up in that building? Was that 90? And did that happen over a very short period of time? So if we again did that, wouldn't we meet our 90 houses, or some combination thereof? So I guess my point is that we were willing to put those apartments up, and that kind of already messed up the number of kids in school in terms of now we need to expand. So I don't think it's fair to say, well, we can put up apartments that are expensive and let those kids into our schools and not think about other ways to build homes for people. And therefore, let everyone access the hiking and the parks and the schools. So I probably went like all over the place because my heart's beating fast, but that's what I had to share.
Yeah, Donna, hi, it's Bill here. Let me just make a couple comments. I want to go back to Sean's opening comment about the flawed 8-30G. Any of these developments that are approved and ultimately built, they actually mathematically reduce the number of affordable houses in the town. Anika, you don't like that comment?
It's not true. I mean,
I can show you the math.
They do, because they don't qualify for affordable housing.
If the developer only...
Oh, so you mean it lowers the percentage?
The share.
Yeah, it does.
Share.
What does it matter? I mean, so here's the thing. 830G requires you to have 10% affordable as defined by the statute. And
15%.
Like to say, well, you're not counting things that are affordable because they're cheap. Well, if we were going to count things that were affordable because they were reasonably priced, the percentage wouldn't be 10, it would be 80, right? We're just saying 10% of your housing is affordable as in deed restricted, subsidized.
No,
right?
I understand.
And then what happens if you're not at 10% is not that you don't have zoning, it's your zoning decisions have to be based on health and safety. And if it's not based on health and safety, then the thing gets approved. And if it is based on health and safety, then the developer loses. And in fact, the developers lose these lawsuits about a third of the time. So it's not like a slam dunk or anything. Given what I object to is Susan and I, and you keep calling me Professor Lamar, I feel so embarrassed. My students don't even call me Professor Lamar. Everyone calls me Anika. Susan and I laid out a really big problem. And then you're complaining to me about a numerator that might change by a couple of units? I mean, give me a freaking break.
I think you're missing my point.
We can talk about solutions, and we can be serious about solutions, or we can sit here and
Am I on mute?
Okay.
No, you're not getting any respect, Bill, which is unfortunate because I thought we were listening to each other here. So let's.
So I want to respond to Donna, and maybe it is kind of along the lines of a comment that Rick Collins posted in the conversation pane. Until we pull out the profit motive in a development, it's highly unlikely that a developer will do 100% affordable housing. So, you want
to criticize developers for having profit motives, but you don't want to let children who live in your town unless their parents can pay a property tax equal to the increment of the cost of educating them. I mean, that is private school tuition in the form of property taxes. So homeowners, people who own our houses, are welcome to have profit motives. I can make money off of the sale of my house, right? But developers are supposed to come in and just do you a favor by building 100 units of purely affordable housing for which there is no subsidy. We are in a state of perpetual fiscal crisis with very little affordable housing subsidy left at the state level. How do we think this is going to happen? The only way it happens is because you have developments that can cross-subsidize, and yet 30% of it is affordable and 70% of it is not affordable. But that's the only way the math works. Unless you want to pay many, many, many more tax dollars to Hartford for them to subsidize it, or you want to elect people in DC who will subsidize it, right? There's got to be a way to do that. I know that everyone wants me to let the residents of Simsbury to talk, but your zoning authority is a function of state law. And to the extent that your zoning authority inflates the cost of housing for everyone in the state of Connecticut, which it does, this is a state issue. And as a resident of New Haven, or as a resident of freaking Pensacola, or as a resident of the North Pole, I have an interest.
You're right. You do. But let me jump in. Is we have a problem in the state of Connecticut, and that the only way for municipalities to raise funds is through property taxes, essentially. And until that's addressed, which we have no control of at the local level, we've got this problem. It is in our best interest to have higher valued properties, because then that pays for the services that residents demand. And I'll remind you, we get $6 million stinking dollars back from the state of Connecticut for all the money that our residents and our businesses pay. And I'm not asking for more, but $6 million stinking dollars. Everybody in this town almost entirely funds education at 100%. The city of Hartford 50% of their budget is funded by the taxpayers of the state of Connecticut. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's a fact. So, we have to take into account all of these variables. And I don't think anybody, Bill, myself, or others, are against solving the problem. But again, it's not simply we wave our wand and open up the zoning regs. The zoning regs have been rewritten 3 times in my tenure, I believe, as an elected official, and not once has anybody had any interest from the community or otherwise, unfortunately, of addressing this issue. So we have not sat here in a vacuum, said, hey, we're not going to deal with this and we don't care. It's a poignant issue now, and it's one that certainly needs to be addressed. But this community hasn't sat back and said, screw affordable housing. That has not been the intent. But again, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution here. Connecticut is a mess collectively. We're all in this together. And we can either blame Simsbury and Greenwich and Avon, or we can get together and figure it out. And I heard a lot of good solutions from both you, Anika, and from Susan tonight, and I think we ought to consider them. But again, pitting our residents against each other and those of us here on this are not going to solve the problem, because then emotion gets into it.
There are systemic solutions to some of the problems you raised as well. I think that Connecticut is one of the top 5 states in the country in terms of reliance on the property tax. We ought to rely more on the income tax than we do on property tax as a matter of equity, and because of all of the perverse incentives it introduces into our land development process. I agree with that. The second thing that Connecticut does very weirdly is that we have a gazillion school districts, a gazillion school districts, and we ought to probably have like 7 or 10, maybe 20. That's a huge problem. That's a huge problem as well. And I'm not, I was asked to come talk about housing solutions that Simsbury could do, and that really is about land use and zoning. But there are incredibly large systemic problems here. Nobody does school district the way that New England does. It's frankly absurd, and it is a driver of a lot of our segregation that we've got. The vast number of school districts that we have and that we fund them the way we do. So I agree with you on all that for sure.
Yeah, and I just want to second that. That when I was asked to do this, I mean, folks understandably said, we want you to talk about housing, not schools, because we're focusing on housing tonight. And that's all well and good, but really you cannot, to Anika's point, you cannot separate those two things at all, because segregation in housing drives segregation in communities. Segregation in communities drives segregation in housing. They reinforce each other. And one of the things, I mean, I think this has actually been a good discussion because people have raised issues to talk about it. But I'm surprised that there hasn't been more of a discussion about the fact that the shape and nature and demographics of the entire region, as I laid out in my report and in my presentation, have been shaped by racial discrimination, period. Like, there's nothing to argue about that. And I see all these comments in the chats like this is a political agenda. No, these are the facts of the region. The region was shaped because of racial discrimination. And the patterns that you see now aren't just because, even people who wanted to live here, that they don't want to live here. We don't know why. Gee, I wonder why Black people don't want to live in Simsbury, because it's nearly all white. And it doesn't feel like a welcoming community for a wide variety of reasons that have compounded over decades. And I think until you face up to that, it's not that the selectmen now who are trying to grapple and solve a really complicated problem are at fault, but unless you can see it through that lens, it starts to become this really narrow problem that's about numerical differences and percentages, when really you should be asking yourself, what kind of region do we want to be? Do we see ourselves as part of a region? And how do we become good neighbors in a larger region? If we're really all in this together, as you so eloquently said, then that's the type of question, it seems to me, that should be asked and talked about. And you have to include schools in that conversation.
I really appreciate that. That's great perspective. I have 2 more people who have raised their hands, and I'd love to have them be able to ask their questions. It's 8:29. Lindsay, can we take a few more minutes?
Yep, I think we won't be streaming because we have a very limited amount in SCTV, but this Zoom particular session will stay active.